sufficient to form a layer several miles deep. But that's not what they find, of course. There's only a few thousand years' worth of dust found. Sounds strange, but that's an indicator of the age of the moon. The Earth's magnetic field. Its half-life is calculated to be about 1,400 years. And based on measurements taken from 1835 to 1965, it also generates estimates of an age of the Earth of something less than 10,000 years. Now, if extrapolated back 20,000 years, the joule heat generated would liquefy the Earth. So you're getting some real equations here to analyze that suggest, obviously, a young Earth. The Mississippi River Delta. There's approximately 300 million cubic yards of sediment that are deposited in the Gulf of Mexico by the Mississippi River each year. Analysis of that volume and the rate of accumulation and dividing the weight of those sediments deposited annually, the age of the delta appears to be, guess what, about 4,000 years. The salinity of the oceans. Uranium, sodium, nickel, magnesium, silicon, potassium, copper, gold, molybdenum, and bicarbonate concentrations in the oceans are much less than would be expected if these elements and compounds were being added to the oceans at the present rate for thousands of millions of years, as is commonly taught in our schools. Nitrates and uranium do not break down or recycle like salt does. And so that's, as you get into the details here, they're rather telling. This all implies that our oceans are a few thousand years old. There's another effect, the Poynting-Robertson effect. You might look at it like a solar janitor. It may help you remember it. Photons, these subatomic particles, slow down the forward movement of objects in space. They eventually they collide with these. They're very small particles, but they're still real particles. The solar drag force exerted upon micrometeoroids causes the particles to spiral into the sun. Because they slow down, they eventually get attracted by the sun's gravity. The sun is sweeping space at the rate of about 100,000 tons per day. And there's no known source of replenishment. And so the current abundance speaks again for a young universe. There's also what they call radio halos. Primordial polonium-218 has been found in mica and fluorite. You say, so what? Well, polonium-218 has a half-life of only 3 minutes. And so this is evidence of an instantaneous crystallization of the host granite concurrent with the formation of the polonium. And this speaks also of an instantaneous creation. And these are just a few samplings that if you get into the subject, be prepared to dig deeply, because most of what we've been taught in schools is myths and legends and falsehoods. Well, let's get on to the second verse in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And so this happens to include a Hebrew phrase that's been the subject of a great deal of provocative speculation. Without form and void in the Hebrew is tohu v'bohu, without form and void. The problem is that when you get to Isaiah 45:18, you find an interesting verse. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. And there's the same word there, is that he created it not tohu v'bohu. So there seems to be a contradiction here. And whenever you find apparent contradiction in the Scripture, rejoice, because there may be a discovery hidden behind that. The other problem with this verse is the word was. It happens to be a transitive verb. It really should be translated became. It implies somebody being the result of an action. An example of that we find later in Genesis where Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. The same word, it implies action on a direct object. And so when you put this all together, the way some people would translate this verse, the first verse, no problem. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, period, new subject. But, and that's another issue, the conjunction there is an adversive conjunction. In other words, both the Septuagint in the Greek and also the Latin Vulgate make that point. It's not and that's neutral, but it's an adversive conjunction. So it should be translated, but the earth became without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And because of this possibility, this is controversial, so I don't want you to necessarily buy into it, just be aware of this viewpoint. But there is a view by some scholars that there is a gap implied between verse 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, period. Great, no problem. But the earth became without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, maybe for eons. And darkness, and the Spirit of God hovered or brooded over the face of the waters. And one of the questions that this view I'm suggesting here was originally proposed by Thomas Chalmers in 1814, and these views are supported by people like G.H. Pember, Donald Gray Barnhouse, G. Campbell Morgan, Arthur Constance, and others. And it's highly speculative, but it does seem to tie with some other scriptures. And one of the issues it needs to deal with, it has nothing to do with dinosaurs and that sort of thing. We'll come to that. But it does raise a possibility, because one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, when did Satan fall? When we get to chapter 3 of Genesis, he's already a fallen creature. We know he wasn't always fallen when we study Isaiah and Ezekiel and other sources of information about him. So one of the questions is, when did he fall? And the suggestion is maybe there was some incidence between verse 1 and 2, and because these terms, without form and void, are always dealt where they occur elsewhere, it's without form and void as a form of judgment. So there are all kinds of conjectures that come out of that. Be careful with those, but recognize that there are these strange views. But the first direct quote of God in the scripture is the third verse. God said, "Let light be," is what he actually said. Let there be light. And there was light. And so it's interesting that light itself is one of the most profound mysteries in science. And the speed of light is usually represented by the letter C by tradition. Measurements of the speed of light are in themselves an interesting controversy. See, in the 17th century, Kepler and Descartes and so forth, the experts in that day, believed that light was instantaneous, or putting it another way, that the speed of light was infinite, very high, very fast. And that was the conventional wisdom. But in 1677, a Danish astronomer by the name of Olaf Romer measured the elapsed time between eclipses of Jupiter with one of its moons. And there's ways to do that at different places in its orbit, which gives you a way of measuring the speed of light over very large distances. And by taking advantage of that, he measured the speed of light and discovered it was finite. And he was poo-pooed by the physicists for 50 years. They laughed at this foolishness that the speed of light was finite, a finite number. It was an Englishman by the name of James Bradley, 60 years later, that confirmed Romer's work, and it was generally very reluctantly accepted by the physics community that light had a finite speed. Over the last 300 years, the speed of light has been measured at least 164 times by 16 different methods, and as we examine the data for that, we find some surprising things. There's a delightful friend of mine by the name of Barry Setterfield in Australia that more than 10 years ago explored this issue and published some papers in this area. And he was joined by Trevor Norman. Barry Setterfield and Trevor Norman did an analysis. What they did is they gathered the raw data from these classic experiments through history, and they had examined them carefully. And they discovered Romer's information with the Io eclipse, his measurement that concluded that the speed of light was 307,600 kilometers per second, with an error band of about 5,400 kilometers either way. And okay, in 1875, 2 centuries later, Harvard University, using essentially the same method, measured it, and it was 299,921 kilometers per second, with an error band of only 13, because obviously technology had improved in the